Hey, I'm the composer Andrew Lloyd Fry, and this is an introduction to John Coltrane. We'll be talking about a little bit of his life, his playing, and some of my recommendations for albums if you're new to exploring his music. So he grew up in Philadelphia, played music in school. There is what's really notable about him is he is not his early playing. It wasn't like he was this like total prodigy. I mean, he was just not somebody that early on was really clearly destined to become like one of the most talented saxophonists of all time. So he really emerges from kind of like obscurity in 1955. Miles Davis is assembling a band, and he wanted Sonny Rollins. Sonny Rollins said no. And Philly Joe Jones, the Philly is Philadelphia. So he knew Coltrane, and he recommended Coltrane. Now, for me personally, those early albums that Coltrane played with Miles aren't like super great. And I don't know if, there's a bit of context that like a lot of those albums were recorded really fast. I mean, they did like 4 albums in like 2 sessions. But it's just like, as a kid, I don't think he stood out as like, oh, he's going to be one of the all-time greats. And then even early on in his career, it's subjective, but for me, he's not sounding like amazing on these early albums he was doing with Miles Davis. So he did that for a couple years. He also had a really bad drug addiction, which obviously affected his playing and affected his like being able to show up on time for gigs and not nodding off on the stage and stuff like that. So he gets fired by Miles just because the drug addiction is too much. So this is in 1957. So he goes back to Philadelphia. He gets sober. He gets off drugs. And that is like a huge turning point in his life, his playing. It just kind of feels like a different person after that. So soon after that, he rejoins Miles' band, makes a lot of amazing albums with Miles, but he also starts making albums under his name as the leader. So his early albums were on Prestige, but the first one I'm going to talk about, this is on Blue Note Records, Blue Trane. So this is the first album that he wrote he almost wrote everything. So a lot of the other albums is mostly not his tunes. So this one's really notable for just his compositions. And the other thing is, I think the band that plays on this one is just like super tight. So he's got Paul Chambers and Philly Joe Jones, who he's played with in Miles' band a lot. And then Kenny Drew and Lee Morgan. I think Lee Morgan was like on trumpet. I think he was like 19 or something crazy. So this album is, it's, I would say maybe less innovative than some of his things to come, but it's just like in the pocket. It's just like the band is gelling, and Coltrane is like a new level of playing, and his compositions are really strong. Like they don't feel like these little, like things like he really worked on versus just kind of like making up something on the spot. So that's Blue Trane. So then the next album I wanted to recommend, so this is 1959 Giant Steps. So Kind of Blue, the Miles Davis classic, was also 1959, and he's on that album. And the Kind of Blue and this are like polar opposites. So Kind of Blue is modal jazz, and it's getting rid of chords. It's a little more like medium pace, and you're thinking more melodically because you're not really having to think about these like millions of chord changes and making your melody line up with it. This is like a little bit like going back to bebop on steroids, specifically the title track, so Giant Steps. And what he's doing is he is rapidly changing to remote keys. So it would be a little bit like being bilingual and being able to talk really fast and say 3 words in Spanish, 3 words in French, 3 words in English, and be able just to go like really fast through all of that and keep talking, and you keep changing language mid-sentence. So before key changes, that was like a part of jazz. Like that was a part of the tradition, and even you're not even staying super long in a key. But what's really notable about this is he was moving in thirds. So when you move in thirds, you're going from keys that are not very related. It's like you're going to distant places versus going to neighbors. And he did it like crazy fast. So, and that's the title track on this one. He also does that technique on the tune Countdown. So again, this is another one where he wrote all the tunes actually on this one. And the other highlight tune is Naima, which he wrote for his wife. And that is kind of a different level of harmonic innovation and getting away from the standard 2-5-1s that was kind of like the bedrock of jazz, and just some really, really interesting ways he's stitching the chords together. So like a lot of this goes back to things he's doing with the chords, which make it interesting. Naima is one of my favorite jazz tunes of all time. I do prefer, he recorded some versions of it later with the classic quintet, and I do prefer those, but still super, super good. And then lastly, this is his classic, Love Supreme. So he, early on, it was like assembling bands, you know, just for a recording date. It's like, okay, I'm going to go into the studio. Let me get this person, this person, this person. I think it was like 1960, he joined Impulse, and his classic quintet kind of was formed. So that's McCoy Tyner on piano and Elvin Jones on drums, and I almost said Jimmy Cobb, Jimmy Garrison on bass. So this was a group he played with for, I think it was about 4 years that they were together. So specifically McCoy Tyner and Elvin Jones with him is just an amazing combination. Elvin Jones, one of my favorite drummers. I feel like McCoy just really fit what Coltrane was doing and trying to do. So this album is in 1964, and Alice Coltrane, his wife at the time, said, I think it was like a couple weeks where he was just working on composing this album. And when he came down, it was like something like, oh, for the first time I'm ready. Like I finally got everything ready. And what I love so much about this album is there's such this like compositional arc. So it's like the bass, something the bass does comes back in the saxophone later. And the first track and the last track have this sense, or the beginning of the first track and the last track have this sense of like relationship where they're on like stagnant harmonies. There's so much to dive into in this album. Now I mentioned that period in 1957 where he went back to Philadelphia and got off of heroin, and he, in the liner notes for Love Supreme, he talks about like this album is kind of like that, in some ways, that journey and that spiritual awakening, and a thanking to God for that experience. So this one, I would say, does definitely have some like highs and lows as far as like intensity. And there's specifically the third part is definitely foreshadowing a lot of his music to come after this that got like a lot more, I don't know, chaotic maybe. But in this album, I love that it's couched inside of these other emotional feelings versus just kind of like that the whole time. All right, it's time for you to go listen.